Imagine finding a diary entry from, like, 2014, where you frantically warned yourself about a coming climate apocalypse.
Oh,
Right.
man.
But then you put the diary down, you look out your window, and you realize the apocalypse is already just, well, it's your daily weather app.
Yeah, it's just Tuesday now.
Exactly. That profoundly uncanny feeling, that realization that we are currently living inside a terrifying prediction that came true while society is basically looking the other way. That is the starting point of our deep dive today.
It really is a bizarre feeling, mapping that out.
It is. And today we are exploring a comprehensive and honestly pretty staggering interview conducted by Novara Media with the author and thinker Naomi Klein.
Mm-hmm.
We're looking back at her massive 2014 book, This Changes Everything, to interrogate how the climate crisis, the machinery of global capitalism, and I guess our cultural obsession with technological fixes have mutated over this last lost decade.
Yeah, it's a lot to cover.
But before we map out this territory, we need to establish a firm baseline for how we are approaching this material for you listening.
Right, a really crucial piece of housekeeping here for you. This source material contains discussions of highly politically charged figures, nations, and movements.
We charge.
Exactly. We're talking about everyone from Bernie Sanders and the Chinese Communist Party to Donald Trump and right-wing populism. And we want to be crystal clear, we are not taking sides, nor are we endorsing any of the left-wing or right-wing viewpoints presented.
Definitely not.
Our mission is simply to impartially unpack the arguments and ideas as they exist in the source text so you can understand the current landscape of climate politics.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because the landscape we are mapping out today is incredibly vast, we are going to deconstruct the visceral physical reality of extreme weather today versus 10 years ago.
Which is mind-blowing.
It really is.
Yeah.
We'll also examine the completely unexpected role of China as a primary driver in green energy, the utter ideological failure of the so-called green billionaires, and the sudden massive strain of AI data centers on our power grids.
And finally, the genuinely terrifying geopolitical prospect of global geoengineering.
Well, yeah, we're definitely getting into that. But let's start with the weather. Because the Novara interview anchors all of these massive shifts in immediate physical reality.
Right. The host of the interview is sitting in London, and the temperature is 33 degrees Celsius.
Which is wild for London.
It's completely wild. The critical context here isn't just the absolute temperature, but the obliteration of the historical baseline. I mean, between 1993 and 2013, London experienced an average of 3 days a year where temperatures crept above 30 degrees.
Just 3 days.
Yeah, 3 days. But at the exact moment of this interview, London was enduring its 17th day over 30 degrees for that year.
Wow.
So we're not looking at a gradual warming trend. We are looking at a fundamental rupture in the atmospheric patterns that basically built the modern United Kingdom.
And Klein echoes this exact sentiment from her home in British Columbia, Canada. She lives in what is ecologically classified as a temperate rainforest.
Right, rainforest being the key word there.
Exactly. Yet, by May, the entire region was blanketed under severe drought notices. She actually brings up this darkly comedic anecdote about a British television crew.
Oh, right, the Whistler story.
Yeah, they traveled to Whistler, which is a town internationally synonymous with winter sports and alpine skiing, right? They went there to film a snowy landscape.
And what did they find?
They arrived to find absolutely zero snowpack. The mountain was just bare.
Oh, man.
And she says they were furious, but their anger was directed at a climate reality that simply no longer existed. But the humor really drains out of the conversation completely when Klein brings up the heat dome that parked over British Columbia 5 years prior.
Yeah, the mechanics of a heat dome are really important to understand here. It occurs when a persistent region of high pressure tracks heat over an area.
It acts like a lid on a boiling pot, basically.
That's exactly it. It prevents weather systems from moving through and allowing the region to cool down. During that specific event in British Columbia, temperatures spiked to 42 degrees Celsius.
In a region where homes are built to keep heat in?
Exactly. The infrastructure was built explicitly to retain heat, not repel it. The human toll was just devastating. Over 600 people died, mostly isolated individuals in unair-conditioned apartments.
Horrific.
But the detail Klein focuses on, the one that captures the sheer alien horror of the event, is the ecological collapse. The heat dome coincided with low tides.
Oh, right, the shoreline.
Yeah, exposing the intertidal zone to the apex of that heat. Over 1 billion marine creatures, I'm talking mussels, barnacles, sea stars, clams, They were literally cooked alive inside their shells along the shoreline.
A billion.
Uh-huh.
The sensory detail she provides is what makes it so inescapable. She describes walking outside and the air simply stinking of death.
Yeah, a billion decaying marine animals baking on the rocks.
And out of that sensory nightmare, she articulates this really profound psychological reaction. She steps into that 42-degree air in a Canadian temperate rainforest and asks, whose weather is this?
It's a correct question.
It perfectly encapsulates the concept of solastalgia. You know, that homesickness you feel when you haven't actually left home, but your home environment has fundamentally changed.
It's like living in a house that someone else built overnight.
Yes. The architecture of your city, the ecology of your region, the infrastructure you rely on, none of it is compatible with the physics of the atmosphere you are suddenly occupying. You walk out your front door and the planet feels like a hostile alien environment.
And that psychological uncanniness drives Klein's reflection on her own work. She notes that reading this Changes Everything a decade later is a profoundly sad experience.
I can imagine.
When the book was published in 2014, the predictions were framed by critics as radical doom-mongering. But in retrospect, the models she relied upon were incredibly conservative.
So things actually got worse than the doom prediction.
Yeah, exactly. The core tragedy isn't a lack of foresight. It is the squandering of a crucial decade. We possessed the data, we understood the mechanisms of carbon capture and warming, and we basically chose to maintain the status quo. So the extreme weather we are experiencing now is just the delayed physiological response of the planet to the political inertia of the 2010s.
Which really brings this entire massive abstract discussion right down into your living room for you listening.
Huh?
The source material forces us to recognize that this isn't about plotting parts per million on a line graph anymore.
No, it's very real.
This is the exorbitant utility bill you are forced to pay because your air conditioner is running 24/7. This is the wildfire smoke seeping through your window frames, forcing you to check the air quality index before you can safely walk your dog.
It's the daily dread of opening a weather app.
Exactly. Because the crisis is no longer a future hypothetical, the narrative regarding who possesses the power to fix it, the protagonists of this global drama, has violently shifted. Back in 2014, the battle lines were drawn very clearly in the public consciousness.
Yeah, the 2014 framework was highly romanticized, I would say. It was essentially a narrative of grassroots, localized resistance facing down entrenched monolithic capital.
David versus Goliath.
Exactly. You had indigenous communities, student groups, and environmental organizers attempting to physically block the construction of fossil fuel infrastructure, like pipelines, coal terminals, fracking sites.
Right, and they were pitted against wealthy fossil fuel executives and free market ideologues.
But running parallel to that conflict was a massive, highly funded public relations narrative centered on the green billionaires.
Oh, yes. The tech saviors.
Right. There was a pervasive cultural belief, reinforced by endless TED Talks and corporate summits, that enlightened technocrats, the Elon Musks and Bill Gates of the world, were going to innovate our way out of the crisis. We just needed to let the free market produce the requisite technological miracles.
But the source brutally dismantles that techno-optimism.
Yeah.
The billionaires did not ride to the rescue with solar-powered armor.
No, they definitely didn't.
The interview points out that a vast majority of that green venture capital either failed to materialize at the necessary scale, or those same billionaires simply abandoned the pretense of saving the biosphere and pivoted their vast resources entirely into artificial intelligence.
Which is a whole other issue we'll get into.
Oh, we will. But despite that failure of Western capitalist innovation, a massive twist occurred in the global models. In 2014, the central horrifying projection for global warming by the end of the century was a catastrophic 4 to 6 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels.
Right, which is unthinkable.
But today, the central projections has been aggressively revised down to roughly 2.8 degrees.
Yeah, but we need to contextualize 2.8 degrees. It is still a deeply dangerous trajectory that guarantees massive coastal flooding, severe agricultural disruption, and unprecedented heat waves.
Not a victory lap.
Definitely not. But it is a fundamentally different world than a 6-degree increase, which many models suggest is largely incompatible with organized human civilization.
So how do we drop from 6 degrees to 2.8?
The critical insight from the source material is identifying exactly why that projection dropped so precipitously. It wasn't because Western democracies suddenly achieved a consensus of political enlightenment, passed sweeping carbon taxes, and embraced a post-carbon lifestyle.
No, it wasn't us.
It happened because of a completely unexpected protagonist, the Chinese state.
This is where the geopolitics become incredibly thorny. The source highlights that the Chinese Communist Party effectively forced a collapse in the global price of renewable energy.
Right.
They subsidized and mass-produced solar panels and electric vehicle batteries at such an incomprehensible scale that they flooded the global market. They made renewables economically competitive with, or even cheaper than, coal and gas.
The historical irony here is just profound. 10 years ago, the ultimate rhetorical shield for Western inaction was whataboutism regarding China.
Oh, I remember that constantly.
Politicians in the US and Europe would routinely argue against domestic emissions regulations by pointing out that China was opening a new coal-fired power plant every week. The argument was, any economic sacrifice we make is meaningless if China is just going to burn coal anyway.
Right.
Yet it was precisely China's massive state-directed intervention into green manufacturing that altered the trajectory of global emissions, not Western free market innovation.
Let me push back on that framework, though. If we're conceding that the Western free market completely failed to lower emissions fast enough, and the celebrated green billionaires abandoned the project, does this mean the source is inherently arguing that an authoritarian state is a prerequisite for effective climate action?
That's the uncomfortable question.
Because if China's top-down authoritarian approach is the only thing that successfully moved the needle on global solar prices, it almost sounds like democracy itself is a liability when facing a planetary crisis. How does the discussion reconcile that deeply uncomfortable idea?
It's a vital question, and the source navigates it by meticulously unpacking the internal motivations of the Chinese state. The CCP did not flood the solar market out of a sudden embrace of global environmental altruism.
Right, they weren't trying to save the polar bears.
Exactly. They certainly weren't adopting the degrowth philosophy popular among some Western environmentalists, which advocates for an intentional reduction in overall energy and material consumption. China remains a fiercely productivist industrial state focused on relentless economic expansion and raising the material living standards of its massive population.
So what was the mechanical trigger? Why dump hundreds of billions of dollars into subsidizing cheap solar panels and EVs, if not for the environment?
The trigger was sheer political self-preservation. The Navarre interview anchors this massive industrial shift in the era of the apocalypse in Beijing around 2013 and 2014.
Oh, the smog was legendary.
It was terrible. The PM2.5 particulate matter levels, the microscopic pollution that penetrates deep into the lungs and enters the bloodstream, were so incredibly high that the smog was literally blocking out the sun. Middle-class parents were terrified to let their children play outside.
It's terrifying.
And what is often underreported in the West is that this severe environmental degradation sparked thousands of grassroots wildcat protests across Chinese cities. Citizens were furious about the poisoned air and contaminated water.
And in a state like China, massive, uncontrollable public anger over basic living conditions is an existential threat to the ruling party, right?
Absolutely.
The implicit social contract, we provide economic growth and stability, you provide political obedience, was fracturing because people couldn't literally breathe.
The CCP recognized that if the urban middle class turned against them over the basic right to clean air, their political legitimacy would evaporate. So they deployed a strategy of managed capitalism.
Okay, what does that mean in practice?
The state forcefully directed capital, subsidized factories, and mandated a massive pivot toward renewable energy infrastructure. The goal was twofold: clear the smog over domestic cities to quell social unrest, and position China to absolutely dominate the energy markets of the 21st century.
But they're still burning coal, right?
Yeah. However, the analysis in the source provides a critical, sobering counterweight. We cannot neatly label China as the undisputed savior. They are still expanding their use of coal, albeit at a less steep trajectory, to meet their surging domestic energy demands. And they remain the single largest emitter of greenhouse gases on the planet.
So it's complicated.
Very. The massive state intervention bought humanity time, lowering the worst-case projections, but the jury is still very much out on whether this productivist model can scale fast enough to fully avert disaster.
It's an incredibly messy, contradictory reality. And speaking of the established rules of reality completely shifting, the interview uncovers a fascinating revelation about the legal frameworks that govern global trade.
Oh, the trade rules, yes.
10 years ago, a massive focus of the climate movement was fighting international free trade agreements, organizations like the WTO, or treaties like NAFTA. Klein's earlier work documented how these treaties were treated as ironclad, unchangeable laws of the universe.
Like they were written in stone.
Exactly. If a local government tried to ban fracking to protect their water or stop a pipeline, a multinational corporation could use these trade rules to sue the government for billions in lost future profits.
Hmm.
The trade rules were seen as immovable mountains blocking any meaningful climate legislation.
What's fascinating here is how the rapid dissolution of those supposedly immovable mountains is a masterclass in how quickly political paradigms can shift.
We treated international trade laws like the fundamental laws of physics,
Uh-huh.
like gravity. You couldn't negotiate with them.
But then reality changed.
Yeah. The source points out that politicians like Donald Trump came along and essentially proved that the global trade system is just a massive game of monopoly. And if you have enough power, if you are the banker, you can just flip the board, declare that the old rules no longer apply, and rewrite them on a whim.
Which is exactly what happened.
Trump tore up NAFTA, initiated massive tariff wars, and completely ignored the WTO. In doing so, he inadvertently showed the climate movement that the legal frameworks they thought were insurmountable barriers were actually just political fictions maintained by consensus. When the consensus fractures, the rules vanish.
It profoundly expands the boundaries of political possibility. I mean, if international trade law can be rewritten overnight to serve nationalist economic interests, it can theoretically be rewritten to serve planetary survival.
Right.
And this realization leads directly into how the Western democratic left has attempted to formulate a political response over the last decade, stepping out of the shadow of China's managed capitalism.
Let's examine that response. The source focuses heavily on the concept of the Green New Deal, looking specifically at the 2020 Bernie Sanders presidential campaign in the United States as the high watermark for this ambitious ideological framework.
Yeah, the Sanders proposal wasn't just a domestic infrastructure bill. It was framed as a massive global undertaking.
Based on historical accountability,
Yeah.
right?
Exactly. The logic was that the United States has been the largest cumulative emitter of greenhouse gases in history. Therefore, a true global Green New Deal required the U.S. to not only decarbonize its own grid, but to facilitate a massive wealth and technology transfer to the global south.
Because the nations that contributed the least to the crisis are suffering the most severe consequences.
Right, and the Sanders Plan attempted to address that fundamental inequity.
But that massive political project failed to capture the presidency. And the Novara interview provides a sharp, structural critique of why campaigns like Sanders in the U.S. or Jeremy Corbyn in the U.K. ultimately faltered. The source characterizes these movements as attempting to utilize shortcuts.
Yeah, that concept of shortcuts is key here.
Let's break down the mechanics of that shortcut critique.
Yeah.
How exactly did they try to bypass the necessary work?
Well, the critique argues that these campaigns attempted to seize the absolute highest, most centralized levers of state power, the presidency or the prime ministership, without having built the deep, resilient, localized infrastructure necessary to actually sustain that power or implement such radical changes.
You need a foundation first.
Exactly. A Green New Deal requires thousands of local chapters, union backing, tenant organizations, and community councils to force it through a hostile legislature.
So what happens when they lose?
When you attempt to jump straight to the top of the pyramid and you lose the election, the entire movement fragments. The source offers a really bleak observation. When these grand, top-heavy political projects collapse, the energy dissipates into the digital ether.
They just go online.
Yeah. Former organizers simply, start a podcast and engage in bitter online factionalism rather than retreating to their local communities to do the slow, unglamorous work of rebuilding robust local power structures.
It's a devastatingly accurate assessment of the modern political left. But the source doesn't just focus on the failures. It heavily analyzes what actually did pass into law.
Right, the Biden administration's legislation.
Exactly. We have the massive climate legislation, the Inflation Reduction Act, or the IRA. The interview draws a very deliberate, stark contrast between the IRA and the original 1930s New Deal under Franklin D. Roosevelt.
The contrast hinges entirely on the mechanics of policy implementation and the psychological visibility of the state. Let's look at FDR's New Deal. It was a massive physical intervention into the landscape and the daily lives of citizens.
Very hands-on.
Extremely. The government created the Civilian Conservation Corps and the Works Progress Administration. They directly hired millions of unemployed people. They planted 3 billion trees. They constructed thousands of public swimming pools. They built the Hoover Dam. They electrified rural America.
People could see it happening.
Exactly. A citizen could literally see a government truck roll into their devastated town, hire their neighbors, and build a bridge they would use for the next 50 years. The government was a tangible, muscular presence improving their material conditions.
FDR even hired artists.
Yeah, he understood the necessity of narrative. He hired artists, playwrights, and photographers to document and propagandize the success of these public works.
But the Biden administration's IRA operates on a completely different mechanical philosophy.
Yeah.
It relies almost entirely on arcane tax credits, rebates, and market incentives.
Which are basically invisible.
Entirely. The government decided it didn't want to hire workers or build the infrastructure directly. It wanted to incentivize private capital to do the building. The profound flaw here is how an average working-class person interacts with a tax credit.
Right, let's play that out.
If you are a renter struggling to pay your heating bill, and the government passes a multi-billion-dollar bill offering a $2,000 tax credit to install a high-efficiency heat pump, that policy is utterly meaningless to you.
Because you don't own the building.
Exactly. You don't own the property, you don't have $10,000 in upfront capital to buy the unit, and you can't wait until next April to claim a deduction on your tax form. The policy is functionally invisible to the people who need it most.
And that invisibility creates a massive, dangerous political vacuum. Because working-class citizens weren't experiencing immediate, tangible improvements in their daily lives from the IRA, right-wing political movements were able to step into that void.
And write their own narrative.
Yeah, they successfully constructed a narrative blaming green policies and climate elites for the rising cost of living, inflation, and high energy prices. Even if the critique wasn't factually rooted in the actual text of the IRA, the sheer lack of a visible physical counter-narrative from the government allowed the right-wing attack to stick and resonate with a frustrated public.
If fighting climate change requires mobilizing the working class who are currently terrified of inflation, they need to see how decarbonization materially improves their lives today, not in 2050.
Which brings us to the housing crisis.
Right. The source grounds this abstract political failure in a highly specific, terrifying reality for renters. They discuss the intersection of housing rights and climate survival, specifically focusing on the right to cool.
The right to cool is becoming a critical legal and moral battleground. During the massive heat domes we discussed earlier, temperatures inside poorly ventilated apartment buildings can rapidly become lethal.
Like an oven.
Exactly. The source details how vulnerable tenants, desperate to survive, began installing their own unregulated window air conditioning units. In response, some landlords started issuing formal eviction notices.
Wait, evicting people for trying to not die of heat stroke?
Yes. Citing lease violations regarding window obstructions or electrical usage. People were literally trying to prevent themselves from dying, and the mechanism of private property was weaponized to render them homeless.
It exposes the absolute precarity of renting in a destabilized climate. But the source outlines an even more insidious mechanism called a rent-eviction. I want to linger on this because the mechanics of it are crucial to understanding why the climate movement is struggling to build a working-class coalition.
A rent-eviction fundamentally turns the concept of a green transition into a weapon against the poor.
How does that actually work?
Here's the mechanism. A landlord owns an older, affordable apartment building. Under the guise of environmental responsibility, or perhaps taking advantage of government incentives for green retrofits, the landlord decides to upgrade the building.
Sounds good on paper.
Right. They might install double-paned windows, upgrade the insulation, or put in energy-efficient heat pumps. However, they use these renovations as a legal justification to clear the building. They evict the current lower-income tenants, perform the green upgrades, and then place the units back on the market with the rent increased by $1,000 a month.
So if you are a tenant organizer, fighting for your building to become green and energy efficient is actively fighting for your own displacement.
It's a beautifully designed trap.
It really is. The source emphatically argues that until the climate movement can unequivocally link planetary survival with the immediate visceral struggle to pay rent at the end of the month, they will continue to alienate the working class.
You can't separate the two.
No. You cannot logically ask a mother to care about the projected sea level rise in 30 years if she is terrified her landlord is going to evict her next Tuesday for installing a window AC unit. The end of the world and the end of the month must be treated as the exact same political fight.
But organizing that fight requires a shared reality. It requires a functional media ecosystem and information commons where these incredibly complex intersections of housing, energy policy, and climate science can be debated and understood by the public.
And over the last decade, that commons has been aggressively dismantled and re-engineered. Which brings us to the media landscape. The Novara interview introduces this media shift with an anecdote that honestly stopped me in my tracks.
Oh, the blurb.
Yes. The host brings up a highly complimentary, glowing blurb written for the back cover of Naomi Klein's 2014 book. The author of that blurb praising her climate analysis, Robert F. Kennedy Jr.
It is a profoundly jarring artifact when you consider where RFK Jr. currently sits in the global political landscape.
It really is. 10 years ago, he was a prominent environmental lawyer, acting as a riverkeeper, suing corporations to protect waterways from toxic dumping.
A mainstream environmentalist.
Exactly. And from that position within the mainstream environmental movement, he travels down this bizarre psychological pipeline, becoming a leading figure in the anti-vaccine movement and eventually forming a political alliance with Donald Trump.
The source uses RFK Jr. as the ultimate avatar to explore a sociological concept called diagonalism.
Okay, what is diagonalism?
Diagonalism is essential for understanding modern political organizing. The term describes political movements or figures that no longer map neatly onto the traditional left-right spectrum. Instead, they draw adherents diagonally from both extreme ends, uniting them through a shared psychology.
How does that pipeline actually work for someone like him?
Let's trace the actual psychological pipeline using RFK Jr.'s trajectory as a model. It begins with a legitimate, often left-wing critique of corporate power. An environmentalist realizes that regulatory bodies like the EPA or the FDA are frequently captured by the very industries they're supposed to regulate.
Which is a valid critique.
Very valid. They see fossil fuel lobbyists writing environmental legislation or pharmaceutical executives rotating into government oversight roles.
They realize the system is fundamentally compromised by capital.
Exactly. But once that profound distrust of institutional authority is established, the psychological leap to a broader conspiracy becomes frictionless.
Oh, I see where this is going.
Right. If you believe the EPA is lying about water toxicity to protect chemical companies, it is a very short logical step to believe the CDC is lying about vaccine efficacy to protect pharmaceutical profits.
And then the algorithm takes over.
Exactly. Once you lose faith in the scientific consensus of the CDC, the algorithmic architecture of social media takes over. The algorithm recognizes your engagement with institutional skepticism and begins feeding you broader, more extreme conspiracies.
And it just spirals.
Yeah, soon you're pushed to believe that all scientific institutions, all mainstream media, and the entire deep state are part of a coordinated, malicious cabal. The initial valid critique of regulatory capture morphs into a complete detachment from shared reality, ultimately aligning with right-wing populist movements that promise to burn those corrupt institutions to the ground.
This brings up a massive point of friction discussed in the interview. A decade ago, during the era of Klein's earlier book, No Logo, the left complained bitterly about corporate media gatekeepers.
Right, the GE era.
The enemy was massive conglomerates like General Electric owning major news networks. The argument was that GE would suppress stories about environmental destruction because they were also a major defense contractor and industrial polluter. We wanted the corporate gatekeepers destroyed so the raw truth could flow directly to the people.
Be careful what you wish for.
Seriously. Well, congratulations to us. The internet destroyed the gatekeepers. They have been replaced by YouTube algorithms, by X, by TikTok. Everyone has a broadcasting studio in their pocket and can do their own research. So why has this destruction of the gatekeepers resulted in mass diagonalism and conspiracy, rather than the informational utopia we were promised?
Because the nature and the goal of the enemy fundamentally changed. The old corporate media conglomerates wanted to gatekeep information to protect a specific portfolio to ensure a defense contract went through, or to push for a favorable corporate tax rate.
It was just regular business.
Yeah, controlling the news was a secondary mechanism to protect their primary industrial business. But the new fight is against what the source terms the tech end-timers, figures like Elon Musk, Peter Thiel, and the Silicon Valley oligarchy.
Here's where it gets really interesting.
They don't just want to gatekeep information to protect a separate business. They want the control of information to be the business. They want to construct a proprietary truth machine.
The interview brings up Elon Musk's initial conceptualization of his artificial intelligence venture. He didn't just want to build a better chatbot. He openly discussed naming it Truth GPT.
Which tells you exactly what his goals are.
And he has demonstrated a sustained, intense obsession with attacking Wikipedia. Why? because Wikipedia, despite all its flaws, vandalism, and internal biases, represents a space where humans collaboratively, painstakingly attempt to map a shared consensus reality outside the control of a proprietary algorithm.
And the tech oligarchs view consensus reality as a threat to their business model. They want to control the epistemological foundation of society.
They want to control what truth is.
Exactly. When you type a query into a search engine, they don't want to link you to an independent article. They want an AI that they control to generate the answer. They are attempting to program the public's perception of existence itself.
It's an ideological project.
Yes, the source connects this algorithmic control to a broader, coordinated war against universities, independent journalism, and any legacy institution that attempts to verify facts independently of the tech platforms. It is designed to replace the public square with a private, monetized behavioral modification engine.
And the physical toll of engaging with this engine is exhausting. The source describes these platforms as utilizing brain-shredding algorithms.
Brain-shredding is the perfect word for it.
When you open TikTok or X, you are subjected to highly sophisticated pattern recognition software that analyzes the exact millisecond you linger on a video. It constantly tests and refines what specific micro-controversy, what flavor of outrage will keep your dopamine spiking just enough to keep you scrolling for another 5 seconds. It fundamentally fractures human attention.
Which is why the interview's discussion regarding platforms like Substack is so illuminating. It represents a desperate desire for a different kind of cognitive infrastructure.
They compare the long-form newsletter format to the environment of a university seminar.
It is a deliberate, structural defense mechanism against the algorithm.
In a seminar or in a long essay, you are essentially making a pact to stay with a complex thought together for an extended period. You aren't forced to compress a nuanced geopolitical argument into a character limit or a frantic 60-second video format.
Right, because solving sprawling systemic crises like the intersection of global trade, atmospheric physics, and housing inequality requires the capacity for deep, sustained collective attention.
But the irony is that the very technology designed to fracture our attention and keep us paralyzed in the digital realm is now requiring massive amounts of physical energy from the real world.
It's all connected.
Which brings us to what might be the most shocking and consequential revelation in the entire Navarre interview: the massive intersection between the climate crisis and the current boom in artificial intelligence data centers.
This completely upends the narrative we are constantly sold.
We are inundated with marketing campaigns claiming that AI is the apex of human technological achievement, the ultimate optimization tool that will seamlessly manage our power grids, cure diseases, and solve the climate crisis through sheer computational power.
But the source material exposes a deeply hidden reality. The fossil fuel industry is absolutely thrilled by the rise of AI.
Wait, really? The fossil fuel industry loves AI.
Oh, they love it. Executives are literally celebrating AI data centers as an unexpected, massive lifeline for their dying industry.
We need to explain the mechanics of why AI is such a voracious consumer of energy. Training and running large language models requires tens of thousands of specialized graphical processing units, or GPUs, running constantly.
And they get incredibly hot.
Very. These servers generate an immense amount of heat, which requires massive industrial cooling systems, drawing heavily on local water tables. A single query to an AI chatbot requires magnitudes more electricity than a standard Google search.
The fossil fuel executives recognize this. The source cites internal discussions where these executives celebrate the AI boom because it creates a massive domestic market for what they term their slop.
Their slop.
Yeah, the dirty, low-grade fossil fuels that they assumed they would be unable to sell to Asia as China continued to flood the market with cheap renewables. The tech industry's insatiable demand for electricity is forcing the grid to keep coal and gas plants open far past their scheduled retirement dates.
Let's contextualize why this specific alliance between Silicon Valley and the fossil fuel industry represents such a uniquely terrible bargain for the average citizen.
It's a lose-lose situation.
Historically, when the climate movement fought fossil fuel companies over a new pipeline or a fracking site, the oil companies always wielded a highly potent, persuasive counter-argument. They could look the public in the eye and say, "We are providing a vital, necessary service to your survival. We are providing the gasoline so you can commute to your job. We are providing the natural gas so your family doesn't freeze in the winter."
And as a consumer, that is a very hard argument to dismiss. You rely on that energy.
But the energy demands of AI data centers completely invert that historical dynamic. These massive server farms are drawing unprecedented amounts of electricity from local grids. When demand spikes, the cost of electricity rises for everyone.
Right.
Therefore, these data centers are directly driving up the monthly utility bills for everyday people in the surrounding communities.
Yeah.
And what is the product being manufactured with all this expensive carbon-intensive energy?
They are manufacturing a technology explicitly designed to automate human labor and destroy your job.
Exactly. They are making your electricity prices go up, burning more coal to do it, all so they can build a chatbot that makes your livelihood obsolete. It is, without a doubt, the most openly hostile economic offer capitalism has ever presented to the general public.
The irony of capitalist resiliency is staggering. It manages to simultaneously boom a massive subsidized green energy market with solar panels and EVs, while at the exact same moment it invents a completely new, incredibly energy-intensive technology that creates a fresh justification to burn massive quantities of fossil fuels.
Something goes both ways.
Yeah, the system can pursue two entirely contradictory trajectories and extract maximum profit from both.
But the analysis in the source points out a massive strategic upside hidden within this horrible bargain. Fighting the construction of AI data centers might actually be the specific, unifying issue that the climate movement has been desperately searching for. It has the potential to break through the culture wars.
The organizing potential is immense because the grievance spans the entire political spectrum.
Nobody likes high utility bills.
Exactly. Nobody, regardless of their political affiliation, wants their local utility bills to skyrocket. Nobody wants their job replaced by an automated system. And local communities, conservative or liberal, do not want massive, hyper-polluting server farms plumped down in their towns, draining their municipal water supply to cool the servers while providing almost zero local jobs once construction is finished.
That's a cross-partisan issue.
Very much so. The source suggests that organizing against the physical infrastructure of AI could unite a massive cross-partisan coalition of environmentalists, labor unions, and local community advocates. It could revive the localized, muscular climate movement that lost so much momentum when the pandemic interrupted the massive global youth strikes of 2019 and 2020.
It provides a tangible physical target that directly harms your wallet and your future employment. But the dark shadow hanging over this entire discussion is the question of failure.
Yeah, the worst-case scenario.
What happens if the data centers keep building, emissions keep rising, the working-class coalitions fail to materialize, and the global temperature targets are completely blown? This brings us to the final and undoubtedly most terrifying segment of our deep dive.
We must look at the desperate, high-stakes realm of geoengineering.
This topic honestly sounds like the plot of a dystopian science fiction novel. But the Novara interview makes it clear that it is being debated in deadly earnest at the highest levels of global science and politics right now. We are talking about technologies like marine cloud brightening and stratospheric aerosol injection.
Let's explain the physical mechanisms behind these concepts as they rely on altering the albedo effect.
Okay, break that down for us.
The albedo effect is simply the measure of how much solar radiation is reflected back into space by the Earth's surface. White surfaces, like ice caps or clouds, have high albedo and cool the planet. Dark surfaces, like the ocean, absorb heat.
Makes sense.
Marine cloud brightening involves ships spraying massive amounts of seawater particles into the lower atmosphere over the ocean to essentially seed thicker, whiter clouds, reflecting more sunlight.
And the aerosol injection.
Stratospheric aerosol injection is far more extreme. It involves maintaining a fleet of high-altitude aircraft flying continuously in the stratosphere, spraying particulate matter like sulfur dioxide to create a semi-permanent chemical shield that physically dims the sun.
Dimming the sun. To give a historical equivalent, stratospheric aerosol injection is attempting to artificially mimic the cooling effect of a massive volcanic eruption, like Mount Pinatubo in 1991, which pumped so much sulfur into the air that it measurably cooled the entire planet by about 0.5 degrees Celsius for over a year.
Right, it's hacking the planet.
Now, the host of the Novara interview plays devil's advocate here, and I want to echo that perspective. If we are facing a reality where the oceans are literally boiling, where 1 billion marine creatures are cooking inside their shells during a heat dome, shouldn't we at least be rigorously researching these technologies?
That's a fair question.
The source notes that James Hansen, the legendary NASA climate scientist who famously testified before Congress in the 1980s to warn them about global warming, is now actively advocating for geoengineering.
Hansen's argument presents a deeply unsettling paradox. He points out that the global shipping industry historically burned incredibly dirty, sulfur-heavy bunker fuel. This pollution was inadvertently acting as a low-level form of marine cloud brightening for decades, creating trails of reflective clouds over the shipping lanes.
So we were already doing it by accident.
Exactly. Recently, international regulations forced the shipping industry to clean up its fuel to prevent acid rain and human health issues. When the sulfur pollution stopped, the clouds thinned, and the oceans rapidly absorbed a massive spike in heat.
Oh, wow.
Hansen argues that we were already geoengineering the planet by accident through pollution. Now that we've stopped, we are seeing the true, horrifying baseline of the heat we've trapped. Therefore, his logic dictates we must urgently look into doing it intentionally to buy ourselves time.
It sounds like a deeply logical plea for scientific inquiry. If the patient is dying of a fever, you administer a radical cooling treatment. Why shouldn't we fund massive research programs to see if it works? Can't we just run sophisticated computer models to map the outcomes?
Well, lab research and localized computer modeling are already occurring, and very few in the scientific community object to them in principle. The profound existential danger lies in the transition to field research.
Because you can't test it in a vacuum.
Precisely. The global atmospheric and hydrological systems are unimaginably complex and deeply interconnected. You simply cannot test the effects of dimming the sun on a localized, small-scale basis and extract accurate, scalable data about what it will do to the global weather system.
You just have to do it for real.
The analysis in the source brutally dismantles the idea of a safe testing phase. It argues that you cannot truly research the effects of stratospheric aerosol injection without actually deploying it globally. And once you deploy it, you are locked in.
That lock-in is known as termination shock, right? If you build this artificial chemical shield in the stratosphere to hide the warming, the carbon is still accumulating underneath it. If a war breaks out or an economic collapse happens and the fleet of jets stops spraying the sulfur, all the delayed warming hits the planet simultaneously in a matter of months.
Causing an extinction-level temperature spike.
Like sec.
But even if the system is maintained flawlessly, the geopolitical implications are catastrophic. Let's examine the Dr. Strangelove scenario outlined in the source.
What does that look like?
The Earth's weather patterns are deeply interconnected. Suppose a wealthy nation decides they can no longer tolerate lethal heat waves, and they unilaterally pull the trigger, deploying stratospheric aerosols to dim the sun and cool their specific hemisphere.
Just going rogue.
Right. They might succeed in lowering the temperature over their own territory. But altering the solar radiation at that scale could catastrophically disrupt the intricate hydrological cycles that dictate global rainfall.
The source specifically points to the terrifying possibility of shutting down the monsoon season in India.
That is the nightmare scenario. You might successfully cool London, Paris, or New York by a degree, but in the process of altering the atmosphere, you destroy the seasonal rains that feed 1 billion people in Asia or Africa, triggering a continent-wide famine.
This is where the stark contrast in the source material really crystallizes the danger. The interview points out that when scientists and technocrats discuss geoengineering, they often describe it as if we live in a Star Trek utopia.
Like we're all playing on the same team.
Yeah, they hypothesize a world where a wise, highly functional, democratic global council with equal representation from the global south carefully weighs the ethical considerations, runs the models, and deploys the technology for the equitable benefit of all mankind.
But we must evaluate this technology against the actual political reality we occupy, not a theoretical utopia. We live in a world where the fundamental architecture of international cooperation is currently being dismantled.
It's all falling apart.
The source explicitly references the scientists who maintain the doomsday clock. Their most recent warnings emphasize that the foundational treaties regulating nuclear weapons proliferation, biological weapons, and the weaponization of space are all fraying or being actively destroyed by rising nationalist and populist movements globally.
And this leads to the ultimate synthesis and warning from the source material, the concept of fascist geoengineering.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, we must imagine how this technology would be utilized by the political forces currently ascendant in many parts of the world. Imagine a far-right, fiercely nationalistic power.
Okay.
A government driven by deep anti-migrant sentiment, zero-sum economics, and a batten-down-the-hatches mentality toward the rest of the globe.
A government that has already demonstrated, through its border policies and resource hoarding, that it is entirely comfortable sacrificing the lives of people in the global south to maintain its own domestic comfort.
Precisely. The source argues it is not a science fiction leap, but a highly probable near-future scenario where a wealthy, militarily dominant nation in the global north unilaterally begins spraying the stratosphere to protect its own agricultural output and cities from a lethal heat wave.
Without caring about the side effects.
They will do so fully knowing and fully accepting that the resulting disruption in rainfall will devastate poorer nations. The technology ceases to be a climate mitigation tool. It becomes an instrument of geopolitical domination.
The source explicitly warns of geoengineering wars. If Nation A intentionally disrupts the global atmosphere to survive, Nation B will not sit idly by and watch their crops fail.
They'll fight back.
They will respond by deploying their own chemical alterations to the atmosphere to retaliate or attempt to force the weather back. It is a terrifying descent into global chaos, where nuclear-armed states are literally fighting a proxy war over the thermostat of the planet, treating the atmosphere as a battlefield.
It represents the ultimate moral and political failure of our species. It is presented not as a distant, abstract possibility, but as the logical endpoint of our current trajectory if we do not radically alter our political and infrastructural systems.
So let's pull the lens back and synthesize the massive scope of what we have covered today.
We covered a lot of ground.
We started by looking at the deep psychological uncanniness of our own local weather. The realization that the baseline has been obliterated and we are living in an atmosphere we did not evolve for. We traced how the techno-optimist saviors of the 2014 narrative, the green billionaires, basically abandoned the biosphere to build artificial intelligence,
Leaving authoritarian states like China to unexpectedly drive down the cost of renewables simply to maintain their own political survival amidst domestic unrest.
and we examined the political failures of the Western democratic left. How grand sweeping visions like the global Green New Deal stumbled because they lacked deep local roots, and how invisible market-based policy solutions like the Inflation Reduction Act failed to materially improve the lives of the working class.
That failure left a vacuum for right-wing populism to exploit the very real economic anxieties of citizens facing rising costs and the threat of rent eviction.
And we saw how the very battleground has shifted. The fight is no longer just about stopping a distant oil pipeline. It is about stopping AI data centers from jacking up our local electricity bills and draining our water tables to power the machines designed to automate our jobs.
And looming over all of this incredible complexity is the ultimate, desperate, technocratic gamble, the terrifying prospect of rogue, nationalistic states unilaterally dimming the sun and sparking geopolitical wars over the rain.
The central unifying thesis connecting all of these disparate threads is the desperate, urgent need for a new political infrastructure.
We need a movement that can bridge the seemingly massive gap between everyday, immediate survival housing rights, public transit, utility bills, and long-term planetary survival.
The source makes it undeniable that you cannot ask people to save the future if they are drowning in the present. You cannot separate the end of the world from the end of the month. They are the exact same fight.
And fighting that fight requires a massive, coordinated defense of our information commons.
Yes. We have to actively resist the brain-shredding algorithms of tech oligarchs who want to monopolize our shared reality. We need to deliberately cultivate spaces for the deep, sustained focus necessary to unravel these systemic crises.
The cognitive defense of our attention is the prerequisite for any physical defense of the climate.
Which leaves us with a final provocative thought for you to mull over as you go about your day. We spend so much of our cultural energy agonizing over whether technology will eventually artificially cool the planet or whether technology will eventually artificially recreate human intelligence. But what if the most important technology we need to survive the next decade isn't a machine, a tax credit, or a chemical shield at all?
What if it's just us?
Exactly. What if the ultimate survival tool is simply the human capacity to pay deep, sustained, empathetic attention to each other and to the physical reality of our shared planet without an algorithm getting in the way? Until next time, keep diving deep.